Good afternoon. I'm Stesha Brandon, the Literature and Humanities Program Manager here at the Seattle Public Library. As we begin today, I would like to acknowledge that we are on Indigenous land. Here in Seattle, these are the traditional unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, specifically the Duwamish people. We honor their elders past and present and thank them for their stewardship of this land. Welcome to today's program with Daniel James Brown, Tom Ikeda, and Michael Shiosaki, presented in partnership with Densho and Elliott Bay Book Company. We're grateful to our author series sponsors, the Gary and Connie Kunis Foundation and the Seattle Times for their generous support of library programs. Thank you as well to the Seattle Public Library Foundation. Private gifts to the foundation from thousands of donors help the library provide free programs and services that touch the lives of everyone in our community. I'd like to give a big hello and welcome to all of our attendees here at Central Library and also watching today's live stream. I have just a couple announcements before we get started. If you're here with us in person today, Elliott Bay Books have copies of Dan's books at their table to your right. They also have an amazing selection of other wonderful books that I encourage you to check out. And if you're watching online, you can find Dan's books at their website, elliottbaybook.com. And I'll be posting direct links to his books in the chat throughout the course of the program. And I also wanted to mention Daniel is happy to sign books after the event. We're asking that folks stay masked in the personalization line for everybody's safety. And for folks here in person, you may have noticed this wall, the door became a wall, right? So if you need to exit the auditorium during the event, you can exit through the door to your right. After today's conversation, we'll have time for questions from the audience. Folks here in person can write your questions on the index cards that you received as you came in, and staff will collect them at the end of the event. And if you're watching online, you can ask your question at any time by writing it in the Q&A box that's at the bottom of your screen. Finally, we're interested in hearing from you. Towards the close of the event, we'll be posting a link to a survey in the chat and collecting the paper surveys that you received as folks head out. We'd appreciate it if you took a minute to fill it out after the program. Now, I am delighted to welcome Karen Maeda Allman from Elliott Bay Book Company, who will introduce today's program. Hi, Karen.
Thank you, Stesha, and thanks to everyone who's attending both in person and virtual today for this program with the book Facing the Mountain, a true story of Japanese American heroes in World War II, published by Viking. And this book just came out in paperback. We have three people, as you can see, on our stage today. I'll introduce them, and then I have some remarks afterwards, and then we'll go to the program. The author, Daniel James Brown, is also the author of The Indifferent Stars Above, which won a Washington State Book Award, and also Under a Flaming Sky, which was a finalist for the Barnes & Noble Discover Great New Writers Award. And also, of course, probably best known, especially in Seattle, for his book, Boys in the Boat, a New York Times bestselling book that was awarded the ALA's Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Nonfiction. He also has taught writing at San Jose State University and Stanford University. Also today, we have Tom Ikeda. He is our moderator. He's the founder and executive director of Densho, a Seattle-based nonprofit dedicated to collecting, preserving, and sharing Japanese American history and promoting social justice and equity. And if you want to find out more about Densho, check on the web at densho.org. They have an amazing collection of oral histories, curricula, an encyclopedia, and some amazing events. And also they have a great newsletter. Also joining us today is Michael Shiosaki, and he's the son of one of the central characters in Facing the Mountain. And he is the son of Fred and Lily Shiosaki and is a third generation Japanese American, or Sansei. Born and raised in Spokane, Michael earned a bachelor's degree in landscape architecture from University of Washington and is a licensed landscape architect in Seattle. And for more than 30 years, his work has been in parks and recreation system planning, development, and management in the cities of Seattle, Bellevue, and Sammamish. And he's currently the director of parks and community services in the city of Bellevue. And like his father, he's dedicated to public service, and he currently serves on the State Recreation and Conservation Funding Board. And I mention all of this because sometimes people who are in public service, as Michael is, are not really recognized. We see the parks, we enjoy them, but we don't really know the people behind them. So today you get to see a little bit, find out a little bit about him and his family history. But before we start this program, I'd like to say a few words of appreciation to you and also to Seattle Public Library. So first of all, Tom Ikeda, he's retiring this year. He's a visionary. He created Densho with others in 1996 to preserve our community stories while our elders were still with us. And this came at a time when significant numbers of Japanese Americans, the camp generation, were reluctant, sometimes militant about keeping silent, even to their own families, out of shame and maybe pride. And he and so many others in our community knew that time was limited. This project, now beloved, was a little controversial. And now we, and I speak as a community member whose family was not incarcerated, but we have this incredible resource now being used for many projects by the next generations. A podcast called Kampu is one of those things, and also this book, Facing the Mountain. And I'll leave them to talk about how the project began, just saying that it's a project that came out of friendship and of community. Some years ago, I ran into Daniel James Brown at a Densho fundraiser where he was in the midst of researching his book, and he was a little distressed by the number of great stories, how to choose. So I, of course, said, well, you have to include this particular story. It's really important. And I'm sure I was one of hundreds of people who said that. This story has to do with Dachau, by the way. So I hope you read the book and you'll find out about that story. It was difficult, and though there are many stories yet to be told, many stories in this repository, I think he tells the story well. And finally, Michael Shiosaki, the son of one of this story's main protagonists, and someone who's made so many contributions, as I said, to our city and community. He's also here to talk about his memories of his father and of this project. And finally, I want to thank STESHA and Seattle Public Library and so many of you who have attended programs here over the years, especially those, since we're at this particular program today, especially programs that have to do with Japanese American history. Seattle Public Library has hosted some of the Days of Remembrance, including one particularly notorious one in 2017, which was so large we had to move it to Seattle's center. They just got right on it, and so many people came to that it was so amazing. I don't think we would see a crowd that size now because of COVID, but it's been really great to see the community support. These stories are our community stories. They're really important stories, and I'm so glad that you're here, and also Dan and Tom and Michael today. So please welcome them to the Seattle Public Library.
Yeah, thank you, Karen. And I'm going to start with some remarks too. As Karen was talking about, the introduction, especially the personal remarks, I want to note that after 22 years at the LA Bay bookstore, Karen is retiring in about 10 days or so. And in terms of the greater Seattle area, I don't think anyone has done a better job, especially from an Asian American book standpoint, in terms of promoting books over the last 22 years. And so, one quick story, and it relates because this was a partnership that Densho did with the Seattle Public Library and the LA Bay bookstore about 17 years ago. We did an event at the Beacon Hill branch. And this was meaningful to me because this was the library that I went to when I was a kid growing up on Beacon Hill. And it was 2005, and it was the book When the Emperor Was Divine by Julie Otsuka. And more than Elliott Bay coming to these events and just selling books, it's really about, with Karen, it's about community. And I remember that day when we were there, we were in their largest room, but that room was just packed. But more than just the number of people, I think over a third of the people were Japanese American elders. And the feeling in that room was just so powerful. And again, through the partnership with the library and LA Bay bookstore. But the author, Julie, I remember talking to her, she was so moved because she's from New York. She's Japanese American. She wrote the book from her family's perspective, but it was her first chance to actually show the community. And she was incredibly nervous because she wasn't sure how the community was going to accept the book. And to see such a community event, thanks to Karen and the Seattle Public Library, that was really special. So Karen, I just want to acknowledge your work over the last 2 decades. I mean, you're going to be missed so much, and we've done dozens and dozens of events, and you've always been there, so supportive, so helpful, and you never said no. So again, thank you so much. So let's talk about Facing the Mountain. But before we do that, just a show of hands, how many people have read The Boys in the Boat? Okay, so almost everyone in the room. And so I guess the first question, Dan, as we get started is, how do you go from The Boys in the Boat to Facing the Mountain?
Well, for me, there's a kind of continuum, which may not be obvious at first. Obviously, Facing the Mountain is a book about a slice of Japanese American history. But as many people have pointed out, The Boys in the Boat is only superficially a book about rowing. It's really a book about that generation of Americans when they're at their best, and some of the sort of values and principles that got them through very, very tough times. And so we'll talk in a minute, I think, about how, I met you and came to the particular book. But I think it was important to me to recognize that, first of all, that generation, I'm writing a book about 9 white kids in a boat, and talking about the incredible accomplishments they made. But there were a lot of non-white people of that generation that did extraordinary things. So I really was looking, before I met you, for a story that would sort of broaden the perspective. And I continue to be really interested in that generation of Americans, both for their strengths and their shortcomings. This is the generation that was my father and my mother, my aunts and my uncles. And we could talk a little bit about how I met you and how that turned into this book in particular.
So let me set that up a little bit, because there was an event, like 7 years ago. It was the Mayor's Arts Award. And actually that event connects Michael and me to the book. So talk about that and what happened during that day.
Yeah, so Tom and I were both there to receive the Mayor's Arts Award, Tom for his work with Densho, and I was there for The Boys in the Boat. And actually, before I met you, Tom, I met the mayor, and the mayor began to talk to me a little bit about his father-in-law and this extraordinary story that his father-in-law had from World War II experience, from his days fighting for the U.S. Army. And that, of course, was Michael's father. So even before I went out on the stage, I was already, well, this is interesting. I'd like to know more about this guy. And then you and I found ourselves on that stage, and I think you spoke before I did. And I sat there and I listened to you explain what you've been doing with Densho for over 25 years now. And the more I listened, the more intrigued I became, because, as I say, I was looking for a story about that generation. I wanted to widen the lens a little bit. And that's what you were talking about. But you were talking also about this vast collection of oral histories that you have recorded and saved over decades. And for somebody like me, oral histories are so very, very valuable. When you write narrative nonfiction, as I do, you need firsthand accounts of people who were actually there for whatever you were describing in the book. So when I heard that you'd been collecting all these oral histories and making them available online, I went home that night and I sat down, I got on the Densho site, and I started to listen to some of these stories. And again, they were the kinds of stories that really draw me. They were stories about people living through very challenging, very difficult circumstances and showing enormous amounts of perseverance and resilience and fortitude and coming together and pulling collaboratively towards a goal. And so, from that moment forward, I was really intrigued.
And Dan's being very nice because, like Karen, when she first saw Dan, he said, "Oh, you have to include this story." There was a lot of that with me too, because when Dan said, "Well, I'm going to, I'm thinking about writing this book. Are there stories?" I would send you dozens and dozens of transcripts and links to clips because the story is just so large. But one of the people I distinctly remember was sending you the clips of Fred Shiosaki.
Right.
And you did want to focus on him. And I want to ask Michael at this point. So at some point, Dan came to you and your father. Your father was still alive then. Talk about that. What was it like when Dan approached you about your father's story? What were you thinking?
Well, like so many people in this room, of course, I had read Boys in the Boat. And, when I heard it was Daniel Brown contacting me, I couldn't have been more excited. This great author who, I so loved Boys in the Boat. Reading these personal stories with what was happening in the world at the time. I think like so many people in the room, once you picked up that book, you couldn't put it down. And so, it couldn't be a better author, someone here who lives here in the Pacific Northwest. And so, I couldn't have been more excited. And I can talk more about, some of the interviews that I was able to sit in with Daniel and my dad. And, I learned much about my dad from those interviews too. So I think it was really an incredible opportunity.
Well, so Dan, going back to you, there were so many stories. And how did you narrow it down? How did you decide, again, so to give you a sense of what Dan had to grapple with, I wanted to, have more stories about maybe the concentration camps that held Japanese Americans, or I was really intrigued with the Japanese American men who fought in the Pacific. That was a really, sort of, I think, controversial and difficult time for the community. The draft resistors, on and on. There were just so many, the women in camps, especially the ones who had to raise children in those environments. So there was just so much that I was throwing at you. How did you come to the theme of the Boys in the Boat?
So, on the one hand, I wanted to weave as much of that as I could in, sort of as the more general experience of Japanese Americans during that period. But I really did need to focus it. I think I remember telling you, is there one person, because a book's going to work better if I can hang it on one person's experience and have 15 different characters the readers have to follow. And there really wasn't one person that could get the whole story told. So I knew I needed to narrow it down. And what I finally settled on was, good storytelling is usually based on dilemma of some kind, people confronting and having to deal with a dilemma. And of the many dilemmas that Japanese Americans experienced, beginning with the Pearl Harbor, one was the dilemma that young men of draft age, young Japanese American men of draft age experienced. Here they were, they're going to high school, and then all of a sudden one day, their whole world gets turned upside down. Their friends, their classmates, their buddies in the neighborhood, whatever, are by the millions going off, signing up, enlisting to serve. They go down to the Selective Service office in Spokane or wherever and try to sign up, and they're told you can't serve, you're a, quote, enemy alien, even though these are American citizens trying to serve. So what do you do? What if you're a young man of draft age in that situation? What do you do? And so that was sort of the hook on which I wanted to hang the story, and that eventually led me to the 4 young men that I profile in the book.
And as Dan was doing this over the last, so I've been at Densho for 27 years. Over the 27 years, I've literally worked with hundreds of authors, filmmakers, web developers who want to use the content of Densho. And one of the things that stood out immediately when I worked with you, Dan, was not only the sensitivity, but the depth of your research. You when oftentimes when people ask me a question like, oh, so what's a good story? You know, I'd send them and you might hear back or they, they may have, read what you sent them and then there might be some comments. But with Dan, after I sent him something, I realized not only did he look at that, but he went beyond that. He was doing more research, which I'm curious because I don't know what actually happened with the Shiosaki story. I mean, I'm curious, Michael, what kind of additional research were you seeing from Dan? I mean, I know we had the oral history with your father, but there was so much more that came out in the book. So can you describe some of that?
Well, and I do have to say, Tom, that those oral histories you did with my father, I mean, meaningful to me now to watch those and hear those words now that my dad is no longer with us. So I really just can't thank you enough. I mean, they're just like little pieces of gold to me. So, and so your question again, just go back to that for a second. Your question to me.
Yeah, the question is, beyond that oral history that I did with your father, what other materials was Dan asking about, or even going and talking more with your father?
Well, I think the Washington State Secretary of State's office had also, John Hughes had written a nice piece about kind of the greatest generation, and my dad had been featured in one of those stories that he had put together. So I think that was another resource. But I think in a lot of the interviews that I was able to be a part of, that it was, I think Dan had really specific questions on kind of exploring some of the details of these stories, and you really kind of honed in on certain parts of it to make it all come together. And I remember that. And I just think there were a lot of missing pieces in all these other stories that were written that I think Dan was able to kind of bring together into a real coherent story.
Yeah, and the work that John Hughes did on that article was enormously helpful. It sort of gave me the basic, pattern of Fred's life experience. So mostly what I did when I started sitting down with Fred Shiosaki, Michael's dad, I think you were there for all the interviews, was trying to fill in some gaps, things that John hadn't gotten into. And it was such an enormous pleasure in interviewing your dad. You kind of have to know Fred Shiosaki or have known Fred Shiosaki. He's a really interesting character, very forceful character, very fiery, and a lot of fun to sit down and talk to. So I really enjoyed. Fred Shiosaki was, of the four guys that I profiled, Fred was the only one who was still alive when I undertook this endeavor, which wasn't really what I preferred. I would have preferred, I think, to have all four, that I could actually talk to myself. But given the parameters of what I was trying to do, I was just so lucky to find you and your dad and be able to actually spend some time with your dad, both for, sussing out some of the details of the story, but also just for getting to know him in his spirit and his spunkiness and his personality. I hope some of that comes through in the book because I was really, really impressed by it.
So we're going to talk story a little bit about the four the four men that were highlighted, and I want to do this because you did a masterful job of selecting four individuals that, again, we talked about earlier, trying to tell the big story, but with those four people, you were able to cover a lot of ground, and each one, in my mind, they almost represent a certain perspective that you could bring out in terms of the Japanese American experience. And so let's start with Gordon Hirabayashi. Gordon was someone I interviewed, I think, over 20 years ago, and he was at that time being honored at the University of Washington as, I think, the alumni of the decade or the year or the century or something. But he was getting this big award. So he was in Seattle. So I did a series of about 5 interviews with him. But talk about Gordon and his role and why he was so important in your book.
Yeah, so what an interesting guy, Gordon. And because we're in Seattle, I suspect many of you have heard of or may have even known Gordon. Gordon, for those of you who aren't familiar with his story, was a young man, we're talking now at the beginning of World War II, a young man of extraordinary conscience. He very strongly believed in following the dictates of his conscience. He was a Quaker, he was a pacifist. And he was also extremely articulate and just an interesting mind. So one of the first things that Gordon did when, after Pearl Harbor, a curfew was imposed on anybody of Japanese ancestry in Seattle, could not be out on the streets after 8 p.m. One of the first things that Gordon did was he deliberately defied that curfew and actually made notations in his diary about the fact that he was violating it. And, you know, that was an incredibly courageous thing to do. He was deliberately breaking the law in a time when there was all this hatred and venom being directed against anybody with a Japanese name. And then when the time came for Japanese Americans in Seattle to get on buses and get sent off to the assembly centers that were precursors to the concentration camps they were eventually sent to. When people in his neighborhood were to get on the bus and be sent off to Puyallup, to what was euphemistically called Camp Harmony, Gordon just didn't get on the bus. He became the last Japanese American person living in Seattle. So instead of getting on the bus, what he did is he sat down and he wrote out a very detailed, clear argument for why both the curfew and the rounding up and forced removals of Japanese Americans were wrong and unconstitutional. And he took that statement and he went downtown Seattle and he walked into the FBI offices and handed them this statement. And the FBI agent in charge that day didn't know what to do with this guy. I mean, it's like, what? Nobody else had not complied. And so they spent the rest of that day driving Gordon around Seattle. The problem was, at one point he said, you got a bunch of big guys here, just throw me in the back of your car, drive me down to Puyallup. I can't stop you from doing that, but I'm not going to sign the registration form. The thing he wouldn't do was sign the form that would have allowed them to register him and incarcerate him. And so they drove him around Seattle that day to different locations, trying to get him to sign the same piece of paper. And he just wouldn't do it. And so at the end of that day, he wound up in the King County Jail. And that was the beginning of a long, protracted legal battle that worked its way up to the Supreme Court.
Yeah, there's one story that he told that I think kind of also shows who he is as a person. You know, he was very principled, and in his mind, it was a very clear choice for him to defy the government. And there was and when he was doing it, he actually thought there were going to be a lot of other people defying the government. And there was that one scene or that one time where he's in the office with I think one of the military officers, and you know, the officer gets a call from the Western Command, you know, I think, you know, General DeWitt's office, and they're saying, so how's it going? And he's listening. He says, oh yeah, so 100% in Southern California, 100% in Northern California, 100% in Oregon is what this officer is saying, that so every Japanese American has been complying except for Gordon. And so Gordon realizes, I'm the only one who's defined this. And I think it surprised them.
And it really irritated General whoever it was too. Yeah, it's like, well, everybody, all these other people in charge of these other sectors, they'd gotten complete compliance. And the poor guy stuck with Seattle had this one guy who wouldn't sign.
And it was maddening too, because he was so nice about it. You know, Gordon, in terms of civil disobedience, I mean, he was really saying, oh, you're such a good person. I want to help you, but I just can't sign this, or I can't do this.
Yeah, yes.
And in some ways, I think he won so many of them over because of that.
Right. So anyway, I wanted Gordon's story in there. I mean, there's also a little later, of course, the young men who resisted the draft from within the camp. So it came to be called the No Boys. And they're a really important part of the story too. And Gordon also became a draft resistor when he was conscripted. So again, trying to keep it to a reasonable number of characters, I wanted Gordon to be telling at least part of the story of resistance.
Yeah, so that was a key piece. So another one, and this is an area that I had not as much experience or knowledge of. And yet when you talk about courage, the resistance and all that and what Gordon did was incredible. But the other three men that you've highlighted joined the 442nd. And for those of us who do a lot of research, military service, Japanese American World War II, we recognize that the 100th and the 442nd, a large core of that was Japanese Americans from Hawaii. Most of my research has been more on the mainland, so I didn't know about this. So this was really interesting to me. And the individual that you chose was Katz Miho. So talk about Katz Miho and his role in the book.
Right. So one of the things I wanted to be sure to do was to get representation from Hawaii, because the experience of Japanese in Hawaii was so different from the experience here on the mainland. And so I was looking at various people, and I think it was actually Brian Nia, a historian at Densho, who connected me to the Miho family. So I wound up picking this then young man, Katz Miho. Katz grew up on Maui at a time when Maui, like all the islands, were pretty much vast sugarcane and pineapple plantations, very racially stratified, brutal system. But Katz's family actually ran a small hotel on Maui. And Katz was, at the time the attack in Pearl Harbor happened, Katz was a student at the University of Hawaii. So he was in Honolulu and actually witnessed the attack on Pearl Harbor from the roof of Atherton House, the residence hall that he was living in. So he saw the attack unfolding in front of him. Actually, some kind of projectile landed quite near Atherton House. And then on the radio, he heard that all ROTC candidates were to report to the campus. He was a member of the ROTC. So he put on his ROTC camp uniform, ran across the street to the armory, I believe it was, where several hundred young men, mostly Japanese Americans, were milling around, all these ROTC candidates. And they were that afternoon turned into something called the Hawaii Territorial Guard. And they were issued these old, I think it was vintage 1903 Springfield rifles and 5 cartridges. And these guys, they had never had held a gun in their lives. And they didn't know how to load them. They didn't know how to do anything with them. But that night, Katz found himself down on the waterfront in Honolulu, in a sort of industrial area, patrolling the waterfront to guard against what everybody thought was going to be a Japanese invasion at any time, invasion of Hawaii. And so it was a very fraught night. They actually wound up shooting a cow because the cow made some noise and they didn't know who that was. There was no other action than that. So, but Katz was very proud. He was in uniform. He was able to do something for his country at the same time that everybody else, all these other young men were trying to do something, young men and young women in the whole country. But unfortunately, his time at the Territorial Guard ended abruptly a few weeks later. And we sometimes are able to show a clip of Katz talking about that night. But what happened was, at 2 or 3 in the morning, he and his unit were rousted out of bed and they were told to assemble on an athletic field in downtown Honolulu. And so the whole Hawaii Territorial Guard assembled in the darkness, and one of the officers, a white officer, got up and explained to them that any of them who were of Japanese descent, which was virtually all of them, were being discharged immediately from service because of their ancestry. And both Katz and a number of the other people who were there that night or that early morning, remember they could hear other boys in the darkness around them crying when they heard that news. They were so devastated to not be able to serve. Katz later was able, when the 442nd was created, was able to enlist at that point.
And for those of you who read The Boys in the Boat and maybe not Face the Mountain yet, you know how good a storyteller Dan is. And I got an early draft of the book to read. And so with my daughter, we were reading it out loud to each other. And when we came to that scene, I was reading it, and my daughter was really shocked because I just broke down, because it was such a powerful moment that, you know, these men who were just so proud of what they were doing and felt you know, connected to this community, to be turned away, to be rejected, was, and the way you told that, I just, it was one of those moments, one of the first of many that, you know, I just broke down. It's so powerful.
Yeah, I mean, particularly when you listen, and this is why oral histories are so valuable to somebody like me. When you actually hear these guys talking in their own voices about the impact that the events like that had on their lives, you know, it's just much different from reading about it in some kind of dry history, when you actually can feel their emotion. And that was very much the case with a lot of these interviews. Tom's a very modest guy, but he's a very good interviewer, much better interviewer than I am. And he's very good at sort of drawing people out and getting them to unveil not just the facts, but, you know, how they felt about the facts of their lives.
Thank you, Dan. So we just did, you know, we did Gordon, the you know, sort of a resistor, defied the government. We did Kat Smijo from Hawaii. So we're coming back to the mainland with someone who, when I interviewed Rudy, it wasn't hard to get his story. He's such a good storyteller. So Rudy Tokiwa, who, you know, Dan and I both joke about, he was somewhat of a rascal, really interesting character, great storyteller. But talk about Rudy and his role in the book.
Rudy grew up on a farm in Salinas, California. And actually, shortly after Pearl Harbor, the FBI raided his family's house. And one of the things that happened with the agents that raided the house just went through all their possessions, ransacking it. Rudy's father had served in World War I, and the agents took out his father's uniform and looked at it and said, "What's this?" And Rudy's father said, "Well, I'm a veteran. I served in World War I." And the agent said something to the effect of, "No Japs served in the army." And he threw the uniform on the floor and walked on it as they were ransacking the apartment. So Rudy was very pissed off about this whole thing from day one. But Rudy's family was sent first to the Salinas Rodeo grounds, which was the assembly center for that part of California. And then they were sent to the very large camp at Poston, Arizona. I think Poston was the largest of the camps. And, you know, as you can imagine, a camp in Arizona in the middle of the summer was an absolutely miserable place to be. But while Rudy was incarcerated at Poston with his family, the 442nd was created. The 442nd and the 100th were two all Japanese American segregated fighting units. When the 442nd was created, it caused a huge amount of discussion and debate about the young men at Poston, young Japanese American men. They weren't sure what to do. Should they sign up? This was an opportunity to sign up and serve. On the other hand, they'd be serving the government that had put them and grandma and their whole families in these camps. So a day came quite soon after the announcement of the 442nd. The young men all gathered, everybody that was 17 or older, I believe it was, young men, gathered under some mesquite trees, and they had a meeting to sort of hash it out. And a lot of them got up and said, "Hell no, no way am I going to sign up to serve this government." Others stood up and said, "Well, you know, maybe if we sign up and we serve and we bleed and some of us die, that when the war is over, things will be better for Japanese Americans in this country. Surely that will make things better for Japanese Americans in this country." And so Rudy was very young. He was one of the youngest men there. But Rudy stood up. Rudy was one of those who argued for signing up and serving. And so he did. He enlisted in the 442nd and wound up serving in, the 442nd went first to Italy, fought their way up the Italian boot to the Arno River. Then they were sent north to the French-German border as the Allies were beginning to close in on Germany. And then later in the war, they went back to Italy.
Yeah, I just want, as you were talking, I realized I just wanted to do a quick historical note. I realized earlier I used the term concentration camp, and you did too. And I just want to mention, generally amongst the historians and scholars around this topic, we call the camps that held Japanese Americans a concentration camp. Yeah, I think in the public, most people know them as internment camps, and that actually is a misnomer. The term internment refers to the process that the Department of Justice did with Japanese nationals, German nationals, and Italian nationals, picked up generally right after the bombing of Pearl Harbor and placed in Department of Justice or military camps. The camps that held Japanese Americans, 120,000 of them during World War II, were not part of the internment process. These were done primarily put in motion by an executive order by President Roosevelt. And during that time, Roosevelt, other politicians, and other government officials called them concentration camps. It was only later when people found out what happened in Germany that the terminology was shifted. And by us using the term concentration camp, we're not trying to equate what happened in the United States with what happened in Europe. I just want to make that distinction that we do use the term concentration camp. So,
Yeah, I would also just point out that, we are definitely not implying that these things were anything like Dachau or Auschwitz or anything like that. But I wanted to point out that actually the language surrounding this event was, I think many of you know, extremely euphemistic, the language that the government used to describe what it was doing. So the places that these people were first taken were called assembly centers, and the permanent concentration camps were called relocation camps. The forced removal from their homes was called an evacuation. And there's a whole number of terms that I went out of I have a note in the front of the book. I think if you're going to tell an honest story, you need to use honest language. And so I've made a very deliberate and conscious decision to even though I grew up with them as most of us have, term internment and all those were very carefully crafted euphemisms to describe what was happening to this population of people during the war. So I thought it was important to strip that language away wherever I could.
Great, no, thank you. So Mike, I want to come back to you. So, Dan just talked about Rudy volunteering, from the Poston concentration camp. Your father's experience was different by being in the Spokane area, which was Eastern Washington. So the military exclusion zone in Washington State was essentially Western Washington. Eastern Washington, if you were Japanese American, like in Spokane, you weren't removed. And so he was not subject to going to the concentration camps. Talk a little bit about what happened to him, his experience in terms of volunteering and possibly anything in terms of training camp.
Well, I think, and I'll say, Dan just did a great job of portraying this in his book. But my dad initially volunteered to become part of the Army, but he was classified as an enemy alien, so he was not allowed to volunteer. And so, he had just graduated from high school, and so his parents, my grandparents, basically said, well, if you're going to be around, you got to go to college. So my dad enrolled at Gonzaga, and at that point, it was an all-male school. And it was an all-male school that had basically lost its student body because, all the young men in Spokane, went off to the war. And so the only men that were left there were people like my father, or I guess there was a naval officer training school. And as my dad described it, he really stuck out as a sore thumb. I guess he was having a miserable time there, and he was basically flunking out of Gonzaga at the time. And then, of course, the 442nd was formed, and my dad secretly, without telling his parents, signed up to become a part of the 442nd. And as the story goes, my dad waited till like a week or so before he was actually going to have to leave And that's when he broke the news to my grandfather and grandfather, my grandmother and grandfather. And, I guess when my grandmother heard the news, she cried, and my grandmother was not someone that would typically cry. And then I guess my grandfather was just absolutely furious that, of course, my dad had gone ahead and done this without seeking his permission first. So it did create quite a bit of disruption in our family. But I think, like so many Japanese American men at that time, they really felt it was their duty. They had seen all their friends go off to serve in the war, and they were not allowed to. So I think it was a very, very challenging time for my father.
Yeah, that whole decision for young men, whether not to serve, how to tell the parents, or whether to resist, it creates so much turmoil in the community in that period. So Dan, I want to move on to Europe and the 442 and some of their fighting, and leading up and talking a little bit about the Rescue the Lost Battalion, which is a key component.
Yeah, so as I say, they fought first in Italy, suffered a lot of casualties, won a lot of medals, served exceedingly valiantly in Italy, but then they were sent in the fall of 1944, as I say, as the Allies are starting to move in on Germany, they were sent to the Vosges Forest, which is this sort of mountainous, dense region on the French-German border. They were given the task, the 442nd was given the task of liberating this town of Bruyères in France, which was where a railroad line and a couple of highways intersected, very important town strategically. It was cold and miserable, rainy, muddy now at this time of year. So they fought very, very hard for several days, finally liberated the town of Bruyères, and then were told to move deeper into the Vosges forest. They liberated a place called Belmont and a place called Bifontaine, just small villages, basically. So they had been fighting for a week, basically, under very harsh conditions. They were finally told, okay, take a night or two, get some rest, find a barn or wherever to stretch out and get some sleep. But on the second night, they were awakened in the middle of the night and told to put their combat gear back on. They were going back into combat. And they didn't know what was going on. What had happened was the commanding general of what was called the Texas Division had sent several hundred of his Texas soldiers too deep into the Vosges, out onto the end of a ridge line where they had become surrounded by Germans, cut off, trapped. They were quickly running out of food. They had very little potable water. A number of them were severely injured. They had very little in the way of medical supplies. And over the course of several days, they began to die. General Dahlquist, the commanding general, sent a series of different units up the mountain, try to get them out. Nobody could break through. So in the middle of that night I mentioned, he got the 442nd out of wherever they were sleeping, and they went up the mountain that night. They encountered absolutely hellacious conditions. At points, they had German tanks pointing their fire directly downhill into their ranks as they were trying to come up through this forested mountainside. So they took absolutely horrific casualties, but they did finally break through and reach these Texans and get them, enable them to get down off the mountain. They themselves, though, were not allowed to come back down to the mountain. They were told to keep pushing deeper into the Vosges. So they fought on for several more days before they were finally able to come back down. But when they came back down out of those mountains, their numbers had been absolutely decimated. And both Michael's dad and Rudy Tokiwa were both members of K Company. K Company and I Company were the two lead companies that went up the mountain that day. So they took the heaviest, those days, I should say, they took the heaviest casualties. So I don't remember the numbers for I Company, but of the several hundred men that had been in K Company at the beginning of the Bruyères campaign, only 17 of those in K Companies were still ambulatory when the fighting was over. So the numbers were just absolutely decimated.
And you captured this scene in the book that was really powerful for me because so they had just rescued this lost battalion. About 200, I think 16 men were able to be pulled out, and they took hundreds of casualties. And I'm not sure what the exact number. I've heard up to 800 in terms of how much casualties they did to save these Texans. And so it was this heroic, and it was being covered by the media, so it was pretty well known all these things happening. But there was this scene. So the 442nd at full strength is about 4,000 men. So it's 3 infantry battalions and headquarters. So it's about 4,000 full strength. But after the liberation of Bruyères, Bifontaine, the Rescue Lost Battalion, and then that cleanup action, they were down to under 1,000 men left standing. The story that you captured was, the commanding general, Dahlquist, wanted to do a retreat parade and to have the 442 march in front of them. And Rudy tells this powerful story of when the general sees, the 442 march in front of him, he actually gets, the general gets angry because he thinks that there should be more men out there and that they were just sort of disrespecting the general by not showing up. And when he got angry with the commanding officer, the colonel actually starts crying because he said, this is all I have left, and the colonel actually starts crying because, he had to order, all these men, who were killed, wounded, got sick, and recognizing the general didn't even know this. And so that was something that, I remember doing that interview with Rudy and how difficult it was for Rudy to share that.
Yeah, so Rudy, as Tom was interviewing about this, Rudy was tearing up, talking about the colonel tearing up. And I remember my wife and I watching that clip, and we were both tearing up as we listened to it. And that's what I mean about the value of the oral histories in terms of really understanding not just the facts of the story, but what the emotional impact was.
Yeah, so the other story that you captured really well relates to Michael, your dad. And so when the war ends, and the soldiers are going back, so your dad is trying to make his way back to Spokane, and so he's in the train station. He's at the train station in Washington D.C., and Fred, your dad's in full uniform, and another soldier approaches him. It was actually one of the men from the Lost Battalion, the Texan regiment, and he comes up to your father and says, were you there at the rescue? And your dad said yes. And the guy says, well, I want to thank you. And he puts his hand out to shake your father's hand. And I have been interviewing your dad for hours. And when your dad said, when the hand came out, I just turned my whole body and looked out the window and didn't acknowledge the soldier. It really shocked me that he did that. And I want to ask you, knowing your father, did that surprise you that he did that?
Well, I think in some ways, my father, who I think you heard is a little bit feisty, but I think my dad was always very gracious. He was very gregarious. I mean, I would say my dad was not your typical Japanese American man of that time. He was really quite the jokester and everything. So, when you talk about that, what that story really said to me, and I had a chance to talk to my dad about that, was really, even they knew at that point, not now, but those soldiers knew that they were expendable. They were expendable. This group of Japanese American men, they were expendable to save the all-white Texas Battalion. And he knew that. And in some ways, I can understand why he just turned away. Because as you talked about K Company that my dad was in, so he was one of 17 out of 186 that walked off that mountain. So, I mean, and I really hadn't focused on that number too much until your book came out, Dan, but yeah, just to think about that. I mean, my dad was a very lucky man.
He was tough too.
Yeah, well, that too, yeah.
So those are just a little stories about the four men. We're going to open up for Q&A. So start thinking of your questions. Before we do this, I have kind of one last question for the two of you. This book was written during a time of a lot of turbulence in the United States, the last 6-7 years when you worked on this book. And I was wondering how the events as they were unfolding, Michael, from your perspective, what you were thinking when Dan was writing this book, and Dan, when you're writing the book, what were you thinking in terms of the relevance of Facing the Mountain, the story of the World War II, Japanese American experience incarceration? How did that relate to some of the things unfolding in our country today? And Dan, I'll start with you, and then.
Sure. Yeah, it was pretty obvious for me. I was by day reading and listening to oral histories about these hardworking immigrant families from Japan struggling to make it in America, the parents of these guys who would wind up fighting in the 442nd. And then I'd come home and turn on the news and I'd hear all this anti-immigrant rhetoric, just really spewing hatred, really vicious kinds of rhetoric. I was reading about families being rounded up and put behind barbed wire, coming home and seeing news about families being torn apart at our southern border. So there were all these echoes, between what happened then and what was happening now. And it really, it was really unmistakable, the parallels, and it was alarming to me. And I think that sense of alarm has only grown stronger in terms of what's happened since then. The reason, when I write about the boys in the boat, and I celebrate those 9 young white men, white men of that generation, there were plenty of faults. There's a huge amount of homophobia, misogyny, racism. But what I tried to celebrate in that book was sort of that generation at their best, some of the things that are really admirable about that generation. And that's what I was trying to do also in Facing the Mountain. And the bottom line is, these were all characters who stood up for democratic values, for a belief in democracy, whether they were rowing against a fascist boat in Germany, sort of showing it to Hitler, or whether they were going up that mountain or closing in, as the 442nd did, by the way, at Dachau in the closing days of the war. They represented something. They represented the best of us. And so I am animated very much to this day by wanting to continue to tell these stories and reminding Americans of what it is that so many people sacrifice so much for.
No, thank you. Michael, any thoughts?
Well, I guess it brings me back to thinking about kind of the classic immigrant story. And I think, given that it was my grandparents that immigrated here, every time you hear about these horrific stories about violence against immigrants today, it kind of brings you back to your own roots. And it truly makes you understand what new people coming to America must face today, because in some ways, I don't think it's really changed dramatically in so many ways. And as I think of race, I think of one story that my dad told me right after he volunteered the second time to join the Army, and he was off to basic training, took the train to Camp Shelby in Mississippi. So this was the first time he had been in the Deep South. And once these Japanese American, I guess newly, well, they weren't soldiers yet, but they were volunteers, they got off the train and they were faced with that initial question as they needed to use the bathroom. There were the whites only restrooms and the colored restrooms. And so they didn't know what to do. So then they asked the officers, and the officers there at that moment said that they were white, even though, back at home, their relatives had been put in concentration camps. So it always makes me think about this construct of race we have in America and what that truly means. So anyway, that's my aside on that question.
Yeah, no, thank you. And so, Michael, Dan, thank you. So, this ends the program, and then we're going to go to Q&A. But Can we get a hand for Michael and So the first question, I think it's from Rao. If the US got into a war with another Asian country in the future, how does the past, the past of treating Asian Americans repeat itself? That's an interesting one.
Yeah, I mean, I keep trying to be optimistic about these things, but as I say, the last events of the last few years have made it very hard to be optimistic. I think the reality is if the United States came in conflict, open conflict with an Asian country, there would be an upsurge of anti-Asian American hatred and prejudice in this country. There's no reason to think that that wouldn't happen again. I hope it would be tempered some by all we've learned over the decades, but history suggests that that would happen again.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. I mean, we have looked, early immigration in terms of some of the rhetoric, the hatred towards, in particular, I think the Chinese and Japanese early in the 1800s, early 1900s, calling them vermin. I mean, we hear about today kind of this, was it invasion theory that, there's conspiracies to take over America with people of color. And that was being said back in the early 1900s that, there was this plan for Japan to essentially take over the United States and things like that. So it's part of our country's DNA.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I learned was in doing all the research, sort of background research, was starting with the Chinese immigrants to California in the 1850s, and then particularly during that period where this notion of the yellow peril arose. American media and Hollywood were full of tropes and associations that associated Asians with locusts and snakes and plagues and bringers of disease in particular. And if you think about some of the rhetoric we've heard recently, it's not just an echo. It's, as Tom says, it's sort of embedded in the DNA of our culture at this point. These images and these tropes and these associations come too easily to mind for a lot of people.
And I think we just did see the upsurge in kind of well, I guess it was Asian hate related to COVID, right?
Yeah.
So this next question is for you, Michael, and I'm going to give a little context before I ask. But the question you can think about this is how your dad felt about the $20,000 reparations from the U.S. government. But let me explain this in terms of in the 1980s, 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed the 1988 Civil Liberties Act. And what had happened was the government actually took a look at what happened to Japanese Americans during World War II and the decision to put them into the World War II concentration camps. And the findings of the commission was that there was no military necessity, that all those rumors, all those thoughts that Japanese Americans could potentially be saboteurs or spies, all that was proven to not be true. And the findings showed that the real reasons were racism, fear or war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. And with that, Reagan signed this Civil Liberties Act, which paid Japanese Americans who were impacted during World War II a $20,000 reparation, and perhaps most importantly to many Japanese Americans, a presidential apology in terms of what happened. And so your dad, Michael, was eligible for that. And how did he feel about that $20,000?
And actually, my dad was not eligible for that. Those were people that were put in the concentration camps. And because my dad was from Spokane, outside the exclusion zone, he was not, even though we have some other extended family that were. I would say the apology was the important thing, that $20,000 was just a pittance. I mean, if you had lost your livelihood, your home, your business, $20,000 30 years later was just a drop in the bucket. But I think the formal apology was the more meaningful part of it.
Thanks for covering. So Tesha, should I keep asking or are you going to ask a question?
We have one comment from Ted in the online audience saying Candace Mahler
No.
bought the book Facing the Mountain and said that she knew you, Dan, and was impressed by the book. So just a little
Yeah, so
nice comment.
Candace Millard, wonderful nonfiction writer. She and I have gotten to know each other a little bit. And yeah, she was a big fan of the book. You know, I'm going to say one thing about it, though. One thing that's been interesting for me, from my perspective as the writer of this, a white guy writing about Japanese Americans. Well, there's all kinds of things I could say about that. But one thing that's been interesting for me is that I get emails all the time from white folks who say, thanks so much for writing your book. I gave it to my dentist or my accountant or my lawyer who are Japanese American. So it's a weird thing. A lot of white people buy this book and see it as something they should give to their Japanese American friends, as if they don't maybe know this already.
I
I'm
kind
not
of do
sure.
the opposite thing.
It's just interesting.
It's interesting because you're actually kind of answering this last question I have is about being a white man writing about this, your perspectives, which you sort of answered. I'd like to share, because I've been asked this question, as a Japanese American who has devoted almost 30 years of my career studying Japanese American history, how people have asked, how do I feel about Dan Brown writing this book? And my answer is pretty simple. I think the Japanese American experience, especially what happened during World War II and both before and after, it's actually a pretty incredible American story. And rather than siloing it in terms of this is a story that only Japanese Americans should know about and tell, I'm of the ilk that this is a story that everyone should really know. And to have someone, who's non-Japanese American, someone as talented as Dan to write this book, I think is a real positive. So that's how I've answered this in the past.
Well, thank you. It is, it's something that I thought about hard and long when I undertook this project. I remember talking to you about it early. The way I look at it is, if you look at the bibliography for this book, if you look at the notes, the back, you look at the sources, virtually all the sources for this book are firsthand accounts of Japanese Americans. So I really see it not so much as me telling the story as me using whatever storytelling talents I have to weave their stories together and let them tell their stories using what platform I have and the abilities that I have to weave the stories together. So beyond that, people just have to decide whether that's cool or not.
So those are all my questions. Do you have anything else?
I think that concludes all of the questions from our online audience as well.
Okay.
So,
well, again, thank you all for being here on this Saturday afternoon. And at this, I'm going to turn it back to you, Stasha.
thank you so much, Tom. And let's give our speakers a round of applause. That was so wonderful. Just as a reminder for folks, Elliott Bay Books have copies of Daniel's books and other titles at the table to your right. And if you're watching online, you can find Dan's books at their website, elliottbaybook.com. And of course, we have Dan's books at the library, of course, as well. And I have posted links to those books in the chat there. And I'm happy to say that Daniel is happy to sign books for folks that are here in person. We're requesting that folks mask up for the personalization line. And we're going to start the signing line at that little white table over there and have it run across the auditorium toward the podium. For folks here in person, you are welcome to head out. But if you have surveys that you want to drop off, you can put them in the basket that's right over here. And for folks watching at home, you can find the link to the survey in the chat. We're grateful so much to everybody who made today's program possible. Thanks to our program partners, Densho and Elliott Bay Book Company, to Karen and Tom. Thank you so, so much. And thanks to our sponsors, the Gary and Connie Kunis Foundation, the Seattle Times,